As probably you all know, FlightAware, most of our code base is in Tcl, and our web services are no exception. We have a couple of APIs that we expose for customers to access data. So we have all this data that's coming in from a number of feeds. It's being presented into a conical view that we then store. There's two ways to access that, primarily for our commercial vendors through an API. FlightXML, which provides like a query-based interrogation of that data, and then Firehose, which is a streaming-based service. So you can get like all of this information about things on flights, from position data that we're gathering from the FAA, Eurocontrol, Australia, New Zealand, our own ADS-B network, the flight schedule details. We charge based on the number of queries that you're getting there. I did look up, so for in 2017, we have an average of about 87 million queries a month. Kind of the typical use case for our customers would be things like, there's airlines who are gathering the route data, combining that with their own weather to predict times when there's, predict and analyze like how to avoid turbulence on the routes. Insurance companies are consuming this data. If you go and you have a plane, you want to get insurance on it, they'll investigate the flight history on the aircraft to see if it matches up with what you're telling them. There's also examples of, let's say when you're flying and you go to sign up for Wi-Fi, it's a Wi-Fi equipped aircraft. The device that's on the plane actually talks back to FlightAware using FlightXML to figure out which flight it's on, how long that flight's going to be, and it'll do its charging based on that information. I think also there's some airlines that use it for tracking maintenance on the aircraft as well by looking back at all of the flights for that tail number. So the first version of FlightXML was called DirectFlight. Daniel wrote it in 2006, I think, and the site itself was launched in 2005. Originally just had a SOAP interface. He was using the Tcl SOAP library, specifically the SOAP wsdl and SOAP domain packages. When they first launched it, we were using Tcl'2017. Later on, that was moved to Apache Rivet. And we also put it on a distinct hosting because of some caching issues with the regular website. FlightXML 2 was our second version of that, where we kind of expanded the data offering. Also moved because I don't know if anyone actually has used the other library, but it had not been maintained since I think about 2004. And so tclws was available, and clearly the front runner, and Gerald here had put that out. Jeff is a colleague of mine, I think primarily did the development on FlightXML 2. It was launched in 2010. We moved over to using Apache Rivet for it. Again, a lot of that has to do with just scalability and support tools, and especially for the ops teams. We're still charging in FlightXML 2 quantity of queries you're executing, and then there's different classes. So basically, the more work we have to do on our end, the more we're going to charge you. New hosting, we went from DirectFlight, now we went to calling it FlightXML. Originally, FlightXML 2 also had the SOAP interface. Jeff had it in 2011, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. A REST interface. It's a little bit of a lie, though, when I say REST. We don't actually implement the correct verbiage for for REST, which is a common thing we see in APIs that call themselves REST APIs. In reality, it's the exact same interface that you see with the SOAP. You can specify an operation in a bunch of query parameters, but it'll respond with a JSON instead of XML. And then FlightXML 3 is the most recent version of it. We're still in beta, about half of it's developed. Again, we've got SOAP and REST interfaces. We've made some incremental improvements, again, to tclws. We've combined, it used to be that in FlightXML 2 and 1, if you wanted to get information on a particular flight, you might have had to make like 5 or 6 calls to gather all that information. We tried to combine those into fewer calls based on things the users were specifically asking for. And we moved over to a subscription pricing model. And just kind of like general anatomy of how our, I guess, architecture or infrastructure at FlightAware When we get requests in front of all the web pages is a varnish server that's doing a lot of the caching. In the case of all the FlightXML, we do have an exclusion so that those requests are not cached. And then, the code itself is just basically a rivet page that's sitting on Apache rivet that calls up tclws and executes whatever operation, the user is asking for, and that will talk back to, either our Postgres or speed table, Birdseye, which is an in-memory database that we have based on speed tables for all the current locations or position data for flights over the last 24 hours. And PG will connect back to our Postgres database. So kind of the main thing I really wanted to talk about for y'all is these changes that we made to tclws, because this year those changes we proposed and they were accepted into tcl'2017, and that was the work specifically that Jeff did to create the JSON REST interface. We also have added a optional operator, which largely just matters in terms of specifying the number of the min occurs in the wsdl document that's going to be created. We added an option for an error handler that can be attached into tclws. You can also specify now if you want to have strict enforcement of your response and request parameters. So when you're developing and suddenly you realize, and especially like on FlightXML 3 does this, to ensure that we're actually returning all of the items that we say we're going to return, we turn this on and we'll get an error in case of that. The version number was 240 that these changes were included in. And one kind of minor change, or one minor difference, I guess you wouldn't see it because this was just internally, but we originally, with the REST interface, when we were using yajltcl to create all the JSON objects that we're returning, and the float type was originally just mapped back to a float type in C, which is that it's converted to a string. You don't round that back to whatever decimals you were expecting. You get whatever the underlying hardware precision was. So we changed that to map back to a number. And in yajltcl itself, it was just treated as a string with no enforcement on whether or not it was an actual numeric type. So we've added a lexer to yajltcl's number type to confirm that it is a number. And I think it will take either like a decimal formatted number, or you can specify scientific notation, or I think there's one other option that I've forgotten in there as well. We added. For the REST implementation in tclws, there's a couple of procs that were added in there. So call operation, that proc existed already. It's what we're probably used it before. It's what you were using when you were making the SOAP operation. It just takes a new argument now of -rest. So if you specify that, basically when you call it, you'll get a JSON response back. So that's really all that's needed in order to get this new functionality. There's not a whole lot of work that has to be done on the back end from a developer standpoint. And then we also have generate JSON info. So this will give you back the same information that the doc would give you. So whatever operations you've specified in tclws, if you call the doc, you get an HTML or text-based format of that. If you call this generate JSON info, then you'll get a JSON explanation of all the different types, the operations, and descriptions on them. And then kind of behind the scenes, Jeff had added this convert dict to JSON. So this is what does the magic of using yajltcl to map all the types to a corresponding yajl type and return that, instead of a dictionary, the JSON object. For the error handler, so one of the issues we have is because we run, we're running FlightXML on each web server. So, whenever there's errors, in particular if we have issues with a particular user who's banging away on the servers because they've made some mistake in their request, we have to sort of aggregate or figure out some way to collect all of that error information in one view so we can see what's happening. So with FlightXML 3, we've been added for the others, but we added this call to specify an error handler. And so that error handler can do whatever you want with it. In our case, we pass back, we have a little UDP service that's listening on one of our servers. And so we pass error information back that way and then ultimately collect it in Zabbix. It's the callbacks can be called with potentially 4 arguments. The last one, flavor, is optional. And if your method doesn't exist, or if it's an invalid flavor, if the user gives an invalid argument when they're making the request, or if you've thrown some error in the actual body execution of your method, then the error callback will be invoked. This is just an example of how we're handling it in FlightXML 3. I didn't include like the specifics on how we look at each. We have kind of like groupings of errors. But that's all there is to that, really. So the other thing we added in tclws is this optional operator. Again, what we found with some of our testing was that if on the client side they didn't, if they didn't have a lot of, especially the SOAP clients, were really picky about whether if you had a min occurs of 1, then it was going to throw an error if that wasn't included. It wasn't all, but it was at least enough that we thought it was worth addressing. So we added this optional operator for your type definitions. The question mark, obviously, just not stealing that from Swift, you stole it from someone else, I think. And so basically, when you're defining it as long, if you just specify the option, the question mark, after your type, then when the wsdl is generated, it'll specify a min occurs of 0, and then you can then pass in your surface definition you enforce required, and when it's going through and creating a response, it'll ensure that everything that's not been specified optional is present in that response.
Question.
Yep.
Obviously, it's short typing, but why don't you just do min occurs space 0?
Yeah.
Add that pair to the list.
I don't know, this seemed harder to do.
Okay. I was just curious.
Yeah, it was just, no particular reason. It was just not what we did. I think we bounced a couple of ideas around. This was just the one that happened to stick for us. There was no great rationale behind it other than...
That was the parallel to using square brackets
right.
to represent an array.
Yeah.
So it was a similar notation.
Okay.
Yeah, so for example, if you have an array type, you type int with the brackets for the array, and you could still specify the question mark, and that would just set your bounds as, the min occurs to 0 and unbound down the max occurs. So yeah, here's an example for in our airport board struct. Most of these items, arrivals, departures, en route schedule, because the user can specify that they only want 1 or 2, whatever combination of them. So these are all declared as optional, and they end up with a min occurs of 0. And just to see like those changes to the service definition. So when you're creating your web service, and these are the ones we're using in FlightXML 3, you get the error callback, the verify user args. This enforce required, that's on the input side. So that just ensures that the request itself has all of the required elements in it. Okay. And in terms of, so we've got a few things that we've discussed adding. We obviously in FlightXML 3 we have quite a bit of work left to do just on the implementation, but we had talked about adding this ability to take a filter from the user that would use some sort of, that would allow us to do some filtering server side for them. And one of the options we discussed there was using OData operators to do that. And it's something we may add. We may actually place that in our tclws fork. I'm not 100% sure yet, but that's currently, I guess, what our thinking was. So that may be something we add. And we're talking about just supporting a subset of those operators. So basically you get equals, not equals, greater than, less than, not, and And that's about it. I guess kind of the main points I just wanted to talk about for you guys today is that, you can have production grade, widely used web services that are written entirely in Tcl. The tclws, package makes it really easy to implement these things. Thank you, Joe. And at least in our case, we found hosting those on Apache Rivet has made it pretty easy for us to scale, because it's just a Rivet page then that's, calling this package and responding.
You didn't talk about the protocol itself, and I'm assuming from the name that it's passing XML back and forth.
It's standard.
Oh, yeah.
It's standard.
Or standard, so.
Yeah. Yeah, the core one, if you don't specify.
REST, and you kept talking about REST.
Oh, that's the JSON.
Well, that's not good.
That's not.
It's not real REST, as I mentioned, though.
Well,
I just continue to use it, just
SQL is not
ignore.
real relational, but okay, I see what you're saying. But I was okay, never mind. I was kind of hoping to see, what kind of queries can they ask and stuff. It's just
Yeah, so I do have, examples too of, if I can get out of this, like the actual queries we've implemented.
Yeah. That's not so good.
Do what? It's a little small. Let me see if I can blow that out.
It's close.
Is that bigger? Easier to read?
Better.
Keep going. There we go. That's as big as it gets. So we have from our standpoint, we have a number of, and I can pull up, I guess, an implementation too.
Is this public information, or is this you only give this out to your customers?
No, this is public. Anyone can sign up. Like, you can go to the web page right now and sign up for a FlightXML account.
And
So I can hit
I
that
think
stick
even
now.
without it, you can get the wsdl, right?
Yeah, and we can pull the wsdl up.
That's the properties.
WSDL?
So in
It's the definition language
yeah.
for some package. It gives the definition of the payload. XML payload.
Nope.
Web services definition language.
tclws. It's very readable stuff. It's super easy to write by hand.
And then if you,
Yeah.
you also,
Okay,
well,
that
if you
looks
want
like
the
XML.
human readable version,
It is XML.
It's fully XML with namespace.
talk the human readable version instead.
Do you have a JSON-ified equivalent?
Yeah,
The
so
rest
you
of
can
that?
do also JSON doc. So I mentioned the JSON
Oh,
doc.
That's equally readable, right?
Now I
Except
understand.
except that it's not been prettified, so
Even if it was prettified,
And
it's
take
only
off
slightly
everything.
better.
it's marginally
Take
better.
off the JSON and it should come back with the human readable one.
Well, the only thing is I don't think we actually, because the one you're talking about, I don't think I have a URL that's going to land on that.
Oh,
Because what's the method called there? Because when I'm hitting these URLs, it's mapping back to a specific tclws operation. So
okay.
even though it's not directly, if we don't have a catch for that path, then it won't
Okay,
call.
because the surface normally would provide it.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. This.
Yes.
Yes, sorry. So there's as I mentioned, like the JSON doc is just a JSON version of this. But you can generate right in tclws an HTML document containing and it has all the operations. Well, so these are all the part of the service definition. It'll list out all the operations.
For an operation jumps in, lists that out.
Yeah, and then you get all the types. So for example, this one returns an airport board struct, which in fact has an airport struct with a bunch of different track airport structs, which you keep clicking down until you ultimately.
And they didn't write it, that's all
None of
of
this
that,
is
it
auto-generated.
just comes out out of the package.
Yeah. So this really came from.
I think you specified the CSS, because it doesn't look like.
Yeah, we use the custom CSS.
But other than that, it's straight out the package.
Do you have any insight into what languages are used on the client side?
I mean anything. So
Well,
we
obviously anything could be used. I'm
Right.
asking what.
use
Common
we write
languages.
we write examples for like pretty much every major one. We have Tcl examples, Python examples, Java examples, .NET,
What do you
C#
check is
examples.
when the request is made, the client string gets passed, do y'all do any tallies on the client strings to find out
Oh, who's using it?
In what type? Yeah, because that'll tell you what type of.
I don't think we do we, Jeff?
No, we don't really monitor specifically, but the majority of our users generally are .NET or Java. There's some Python.
PHP, a lot of PHP. Not as many on the Tcl side, I don't
Yeah, I
think.
don't think we've had any users actually use
We still have a couple of people using Cold Fusion. I recently had someone asking a question about that. But yeah, the documentation, when we define a type here, so when you're defining the type, you can add a comment as part of the list for the type definition, and this comment will then be included in that automatically generated document. I think that's it. And like I mentioned, there is actually in tclws, there is a client option as well.
Yeah.
So, for example, in our examples, this is we have an example where it does a query against FlightXML using tclws client package. So you can write the client side in Tcl as well.
People have to subscribe to get the real data. I mean, do you have a development server where people can get bogus data for development purposes?
You can get real data for free. We have a free package for FlightXML 3.
Yeah, so the latest, that was a complaint in previous versions, FlightXML 2, there was no free tier, no development version that has dummy data. We still don't have because we just don't generate dummy data. We have plenty of real data.
Well, take a snapshot of real data from 2014 that nobody cares about or something.
Right.
That's worth money.
Yeah, but we don't offer that, but we do have for a free tier, so you can do 500 queries a month for free with FlightXML 3.
If I'm developing a product, I'm going to do 500 queries in a matter of minutes.
Well, then you call if you're developing a commercial product, they probably call sales, and sales works out some deal with it.
Okay, fair enough.
Anything else? All right, thanks everybody.